Hello, and welcome to the first in a four-part series of videos documenting some exciting new applied watershed science from the Susquehanna River Basin Commission and our partners. In this video, we'll summarize what we did and what we learned, and in subsequent videos, we'll dive more deeply into the nuts and bolts of the work. This work is concerned with how conditions on the landscape relate to excess sediment in streams in the Susquehanna Basin. We're going to talk about why excess sediment in streams matters and what motivated us to investigate. We'll also explore the causes of these problems and review some possible solutions. This work was made possible with generous funding to the Susquehanna River Basin Commission from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, with matching funds from partners. This was a team effort and wouldn't have been possible without the commitment of our diverse group of collaborators, many of whom call the Susquehanna watershed home. The original intent of this work was to determine whether unconventional natural gas production from the Marcellus Shale formation is affecting streams and rivers of the Susquehanna River Basin. The industry entered the basin with little fanfare in 2006 when the first two Marcellus Shale wells were drilled, but to date, roughly half the Marcellus Shale wells in Pennsylvania have been installed in the Susquehanna River Basin. The Marcellus Shale is a big deal. Since 2011, it has been the biggest producer of onshore natural gas in the United States. Our secondary goal was to compile recommendations and best management practices designed to shield the basin's aquatic resources from the types of damages that have, unfortunately, characterized the region's energy and natural resource extraction activities throughout history. Through this project, our partnership ultimately uncovered new insights about causes and effects of water pollution, and significantly, these findings are not unique to unconventional natural gas production and demonstrate that many types of water pollution are related to hydrologic alteration. The 27,500 square mile Susquehanna River Basin has its northern reaches in New York and covers nearly half of Pennsylvania. It flows briefly through Maryland before entering the Chesapeake Bay at Havre de Grace, Maryland. The Susquehanna is the largest river that enters the Chesapeake Bay. The basin played an invaluable role in the history of the United States. During the early days of the North American colonial era, the lower Susquehanna River was a major trade and transportation route between port cities in the interior of the New World. The Susquehanna's modern transportation geography came to fruition in the rapid industrial development between 1850 and 1925. During that 75-year span, the Susquehanna region drove much of the young nation's growth. The rail booms of the 19th century resulted in the rapid expansion of settlements, roads, and rails, and helped grow Pennsylvania's first wave of resource extraction industries, timber and coal. Today, the main industrial use of the Susquehanna River is for electrical power production, and the basin is home to 3 nuclear, 5 main stem hydroelectric, and more than a dozen hydrocarbon-fueled power stations. The Susquehanna River is also heavily utilized for water supply and for recreation. Like many rivers in the densely populated and developed parts of the eastern United States, the Susquehanna River faces a number of environmental challenges, including combined impacts associated with stormwater, wastewater treatment, agriculture, and barriers to the movement of aquatic life created by dams. The Susquehanna River Basin Commission was formed to respond to challenges of water use, availability, and quality, and balances the interests of New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and the federal government. The primary aim of the Commission is to coordinate activities around water quantity, and the Commission has regulatory power over specific water withdrawals and similar uses within the basin. Broadly speaking, the Commission supports and extends the capacity of state environmental agencies by developing science that can balance the needs of the ecosystem with human activity both now and in the future. The story of this project really starts in the mid-2000s. Much of Pennsylvania was abuzz with a new word, Marcellus. Natural gas from the Marcellus Shale formation, which underlies most of the Susquehanna watershed, was a hot topic. Points of view on the subject were wide-ranging, from ecstatic celebration over the potential for economic renewal to stern caution about a slate of possible environmental impacts. The one thing everyone could agree on was that development was happening fast and the footprint of the industry was broad. The Commission and its partners were committed to understanding any possible relationship between Marcellus Shale development and water quality in the watershed, and making sense of these complex issues took us down a long but ultimately informative road. All good science starts with data and observations, so from the outset the Commission and its partners worked feverishly to collect water quality data from across the basin. This involved establishing a remote water quality monitoring network made up of in-stream stations that constantly measure a variety of water quality indicators and report that data back through cellular communication. All of these data are publicly available and the monitoring network is still up and running today. Before we go any further, let's give a precise definition of a watershed. A watershed is the area of land that drains into a given water body or waterway. Naturally, watersheds can be very different sizes, from the huge Mississippi River watershed, which includes a large portion of the United States, down to the watershed for a small single stream. Rain and snow that falls anywhere within the Susquehanna Basin ultimately drains to the Susquehanna River and eventually reaches the Chesapeake Bay. Really large watersheds, like the Mississippi or Susquehanna, are often called basins, a term we have used and will use throughout this video. But it's not just water that flows downstream and collects in a watershed. Pollution follows the same pathways. Within the Susquehanna Basin, that means all sorts of pollutants, including excess sediment, also flow to the Chesapeake Bay. You've probably heard the phrase, everyone lives downstream, and that idea is especially important in the context of excess sediment pollution because the problems caused by excess sediment are felt in one part of the watershed, but originate elsewhere. So what is excess sediment exactly, and why does it matter? Sediment refers to physical particles that get suspended in water. Those particles can be minerals like clay, silt, or sand, organic matter like plankton, algae, or decaying plants, or even inorganic material like bits of tires from roadways. Some amount of sediment in streams is a natural and necessary part of every waterway, but too much sediment input from the watershed creates problems. One of the measurements made by SRBC's Remote Water Quality Monitoring Network is turbidity. Notice that I said turbidity and not sediment. So what is turbidity? Great question. Turbidity is a measure of how cloudy water is. Anytime material is suspended in water, the water loses some amount of clarity. Turbidity meters shine a light across a known gap and measure how much of the light gets scattered before reaching the far side. Turbidity, it turns out, when measured with a regular frequency, is a very good way to understand suspended sediment in a waterway, and importantly, it presents a strong, reliable signal for a type of hydrologic alteration within a watershed. Why is excess sediment an important issue in the Susquehanna Basin? There are several reasons. First, it's an expensive problem for water suppliers. Water has to be filtered and treated before it's suitable for drinking or other potable water needs, such as industrial uses. Secondly, excess sediment harms the creatures that call those waterways home. Within the Susquehanna Basin, native fishes such as brook trout require clean gravel to lay their eggs. If those eggs are covered in sediment, they won't survive. Similarly, the aquatic insects upon which fish and animals of all kinds feed require relatively sediment-free rocks to survive. On the downstream end, the Chesapeake Bay is impaired by high levels of sediment and nutrients. These pollutants cause algae blooms that create dead zones where fish and shellfish can't survive, block sunlight needed for underwater grasses, and smother aquatic life on the bottom. Lastly, waterways afflicted by excess sediment also tend to be less desirable for recreational uses such as swimming, fishing, and boating. In 2010, a comprehensive cleanup plan called a Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL, was released for the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed. The plan calculates the total amount of sediment that each river, including the Susquehanna, can deliver downstream in order to protect the bay's aquatic life and underwater grasses. Reducing excess sediment in the Susquehanna watershed will help bring the Chesapeake Bay back to health. So why is excess sediment being produced in the basin? High turbidity and excess sediment are symptoms of other things, including hydrologic alteration, poor land management, and legacy environmental issues that, despite having been remediated in many cases, still exert influence over present conditions. Hydrologic alteration sounds like a bit of a heavy term, but it's an important concept if we're to understand the problems and solutions, so let's spend some time with it. From about 19,000 years ago until the early 1800s, the entire eastern United States, including the Susquehanna Basin, was covered in unbroken, mature forests. These forests excelled at slowing and capturing rainfall, resulting in streams that had relatively stable flows, especially compared to many streams in the modern landscape. These streams rarely experienced intense flooding because forests slow the rate at which rain is carried to the stream, and they rarely experienced intense drought because of the forest's ability to continuously and slowly release water to those streams. When Europeans arrived here, the region's original forests were removed wholesale. Forests have returned since, but they are very different than the original forests, and they are bisected by roads, railroads, settlements, mining, and agriculture. The upshot of this is that rainfall is not slowed down as much as in the past. Water is carried to streams much more quickly, resulting in more extreme high and low flows. This, the large changes in the way land and landscapes control water, is hydrologic alteration. These effects have accumulated in watersheds, leading to instability even in areas that many of us might think of as pristine. For some, the prospect of a boom of natural gas development begged a question. Could these widespread industrial-scale activities cause profound and irreparable harm to the basin streams and rivers? Most parts of the basin where Marcellus activity could be found in 2006 had little or no prior experience with natural gas production of any sort, leading to a knowledge gap, and these activities were alarming for many, in no small part because of the scale. Marcellus wells, also known as unconventional natural gas wells, require a much larger footprint than conventional wells, and they require more infrastructure such as bigger pads, wider roads, water impoundments, waste handling areas, and pipelines. Concerns and controversy about the safety of unconventional natural gas development abounded, especially in regard to the use of hydraulic fracturing. One fact remains non-controversial. The pace and intensity of unconventional natural gas development in Pennsylvania was meteoric. A lot of change was happening on the ground in a very short amount of time. A survey conducted by the Susquehanna River Basin Commission at the start of this project found that most respondents believed that natural gas infrastructure was causing erosion and sedimentation in the watershed. Our planned investigation relied on comparing the turbidity data for a watershed with measures of natural gas infrastructure within the same watershed. We started out by attempting to map natural gas well pads and associated activities across study watersheds over time, but we quickly learned that mapping the footprint of the expansion of unconventional natural gas infrastructure was exceedingly complex, especially if we hoped to relate turbidity at a specific time to the landscape at a specific time. Nonetheless, we created the infrastructure maps for a select area and then turned those maps into numbers by asking questions like, what percentage of the acreage of the watershed is occupied by well pads? Or, what is the density of well pads in the watershed? We found that none of the resulting metrics were very good at explaining turbidity in streams. This was perplexing because many of these watersheds are quite forested even after natural gas infrastructure is put in place, but they also exhibit greater than expected turbidity. What would explain this? In a word, roads. More specifically, how much of the watershed flowed to a road. This is where hydrologic alteration really comes into play. Let's consider a forested hillside. As rain falls, forest cover interrupts and slows water, causing much of it to percolate into the ground where it is drawn into plants or it continues to move slowly below ground towards an aquifer, spring, or waterway. Some small amount of water runs over ground downhill as well. Now let's put a road on that hillside. Despite the fact that overall most of the trees are still intact, this results in a surprising amount of change, especially as the effects of that change begin to accumulate in the watershed. Runoff and rainwater that comes in contact with roads is often captured in a ditch. The water then moves downhill through culverts. Depending on how deep of a cut was required to build a road, the road could also capture groundwater that was absorbed into the soil and move it to the surface. Even though the water may be moving slowly through the forested area before reaching the road, once it reaches the road, the water moves faster and is concentrated into a smaller area. The faster water moves, the more energy it has, so it is able to pick up additional sediment, which in turn is now much more likely to reach surface waters after traveling through culverts and ditches. Understanding this, however, still left the question open of how best to measure the effect of roads on observed turbidity, if an effect existed at all. We decided to look more closely at the network of roads and pipelines in our study area in order to quantify their influence on water. Using the latest and most detailed digital elevation data available, we identified areas where, if a raindrop were to fall, it would run into or be captured by a road as it moves downhill. We name these areas hydrologic capture zones. After mapping all of the separate hydrologic capture zones in a watershed, we added up the portion of the watershed that falls within a hydrologic capture zone. This percentage provides a window into the stability of the watershed's hydrology. It's helpful to consider these numbers as we look at some maps. This is a watershed, Baker's Creek, where 26% of the surface is within a hydrologic capture zone. In effect, this means that only a small part of the rainfall in this watershed is likely to be influenced by a road or a roadside drainage. Counter this with another watershed, Larry's Creek, where 43% of the surface is within a hydrologic capture zone. Within this watershed, a large portion of the precipitation in the watershed is likely to be influenced by a road or roadside drainage. When we compared these percentages to the field turbidity data, a relationship immediately became apparent. Watersheds with lots of roads and pipelines, especially low elevation roads and pipelines, have higher turbidity than those with fewer roads and pipelines. This is true even in watersheds with a lot of intact forest. Roads are everywhere. Untold miles of roads have been constructed through the history of the United States, and many, such as logging roads, have been abandoned. Abandonment, however, doesn't mean that the landscapes that were cross-cut by these roads magically return to their previous state. These roads still exist and still capture water, affecting the hydrology of the forest. Roads are a permanent change to landscapes, and they have measurable effects on water quality. Not all roads are created equally, however. The location and design of the roads and roadside drainage systems matters a great deal. This brings us back to Marcellus Shale gas development, which, not surprisingly, makes use of a lot of roads. The industry has shown a preference for using existing roads and making improvements to those roads where needed, but, like beauty and good taste, road improvements tend to be in the eyes of the beholder. Arguably, most of the roadway improvements fostered by the gas industry were designed to improve the passability of roads to the industry's traffic, as well as accommodate local concerns. These are reasonable motivations, of course, but they are not necessarily in line with the impact to water resources. The initial unconventional natural gas boom has subsided since 2012, but another cycle of heavy activity will certainly occur in the future. Since the Federal Clean Water Act was passed in 1972, Pennsylvania's efforts to reduce water pollution have evolved. Alongside refined water science and pollution science, views about the role of government in managing natural resources have changed, resulting in a regulatory standard to protect, maintain, and improve the Commonwealth's water resources while allowing for the continued growth and development of Pennsylvania. The results of this project add insight into new ways to minimize water pollution. The hydrologic capture zone methodology provides an intuitive tool to better plan land development, which will enable engineers and road and natural resource managers to improve existing roads and to build new roads with an eye towards better protecting Pennsylvania's waterways. If you'd like more details about the methods, data, and techniques that we utilize in this work, please check out parts 2 and 3 of this series, Data Analysis and GIS Techniques. The fourth and final video of the series goes into the field with the Penn State Center for Dirt and Gravel Road Studies, where they talk about and demonstrate some road building methods that work more harmoniously with forest hydrology. Thanks for watching, and be sure to check out our other videos.